Hi, welcome to my Wolf Island studio. You met some of my favorite painting subjects on the way in. The cows. They live in the field across from our house. So today I'd like to show you some of my artwork. Kind of a retrospective. I'm going to go back to early days and bring it up to the present and talk to you about the path and how my work has evolved over time and the path of my life over that time and how one has kind of influenced the other, which is something I always find interesting when I look at an artist's work, to ask myself, why are they painting that subject and why are they painting it that way? So I want to shed a bit of light on my own development. So as a kid, I was really into ballet. I wanted to be a ballerina, and that was my life's ambition until I was around 16. And then it was time for Plan B. So at the time, my two favorite subjects were art and science, physics especially. And so I thought, I will study both in university and I'll be an artist and a physicist. And then I found out the universities don't actually let you do that, although I really think they should. So I was left with a dilemma. I wasn't really ready to give up on art or science. And my father was an architect. So that would seem to represent the obvious solution, but he didn't make architecture seem very glamorous. His firm was almost exclusively designing warehouses at the time, and it just had no appeal. But then one day he pulled out a portfolio of drawings that he had done as an architecture student at McGill. And they were beautiful, these delicately rendered pencil drawings, and I wanted to learn to draw like that. So I enrolled in architecture at McGill. And when I got there, discovered that the same art teacher who had taught my father, whose name was Gentile Tondino, was still there at the school, and he became my art teacher. So once a week, the class would convene in the art room, and we had a live model every day, once a week for 3 years. And we would learn life drawing. So it was a very traditional way of getting into art. And Tondino had a few favorite things that he would repeat over and over until they were just embedded in our brains. One was, draw what you see, not what you know. And that has remained my mantra for a long time, although I've also struggled to unfollow that directive, and I'll talk a bit about that later. He would also go around and confiscate the tubes of white paint from our watercolor set, so that was another cardinal sin, never use white paint in watercolor, which is also a rule that I happily learned to break later on. And never work from photographs, which again, I have broken many times over. But he was a really great teacher. And in addition to life drawing, the class would get together with him in a small town at the end of every summer, and we would just sketch for a whole week and try to put together a portfolio of drawings that would convey the sense of that place. So that was kind of my beginning. I graduated, got married, and promptly got laid off. That was 1990, start of the recession in Quebec, and there was really no hope of employment. So my husband had also just graduated in English and music and was not employed either. And we figured, hey, if we're going to be broke and unemployed, let's go and be broke and unemployed by the ocean. So we packed our belongings onto a train and moved to Halifax, and that was the start of a really idyllic year. I painted full-time. Rob wrote and played the piano, and for me, it was the first time I'd ever really devoted myself full-time to painting, and so, not surprisingly, my artwork really developed. I worked mostly in watercolors, took a couple of courses at NSCAD, Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, in printmaking. I was thinking at the time maybe I'd go back and do a master's in fine art, which never happened. But I kind of broadened by trying different media, and I really enjoyed that. And then at the end of that year, Rob was accepted into a master's program at Concordia back in Montreal, and so we moved back. And I kept painting, I kept sketching. Some of the work was on site, some was from photos, especially in the winter. Still working in watercolor and painting all those Montreal street scenes that I love. And my father's firm hired me, so there I was, designing warehouses, which wasn't much of a creative outlet. So that probably prompted me to really delve into my art whenever I had the time. And again, took courses, dabbled a little bit in oils and in acrylics. Didn't really have an aptitude for either and didn't put enough effort into them at that time to gain any kind of proficiency. So I really remained committed to working in watercolor at that time. And then we had a baby. Our daughter Laura was born. And we're kind of at a crossroads because we'd been living in the inner city in Montreal and loving it in a small apartment. But then we were faced with that question that many couples face of, how are we going to raise a family and have the lifestyle that we really want on the combined earnings of a junior architect and a musician? So my family had a house in Vermont, a cottage, when I was a kid, and I had loved living there. And Rob and I had been taking forays out into the countryside on our bikes and always loved it. So we made the bold move to move to the country. We packed our belongings again and bought a 40-acre hayfield here on Wolfe Island. And I designed a house, which of course has a full art studio, which I'm in right now. It's the 3rd floor of our house. And we built it ourselves while our little toddler Laura watched and played. And that sort of began a whole new chapter in my life. And over the next few years, I planted a big vegetable garden and flowers, and we started raising chickens and turkeys and rabbits. And we had sheep for a few years and a donkey. And of course, all of those were fantastic drawing subjects and painting subjects. Here are some of my paintings from that time. Again, working in watercolor. And gradually over time, my watercolors became, I guess, more controlled. Starting out, and I think a lot of artists kind of follow this path. Starting out, I was mostly sketching on location. The watercolors were very loose and fast and painterly. And I was always trying to capture what I was looking at, but the lack of skill meant that, that was always a challenge and I never quite got it. But as I became more proficient and also worked more from photographs because of time constraints and having a baby, and after a while our son had been born as well, so now we had 2 kids, and I was working in architecture in Kingston. So what happened is, as my skills developed, the paintings became tighter. I would know at the beginning of a painting what I wanted it to look like by the end, and I could generally achieve it. And so while the work became quite strong, the process became less creative for me than what I really wanted. And I kind of struggled with this for a few years while I kept producing these landscapes and paintings of animals, and I was happy with them. I was happy with the results. But I would go to galleries and look at other artists' work, and it would just seem more creative in a way, more intuitive and expressive, particularly when there were abstract elements. And by and large, these artists were working in acrylics or oils. They generally weren't working in watercolors. And I started to realize that if I wanted to make that leap into that type of artwork, I was going to have to start working in acrylics. I really didn't want to work in oils. Around the same time, there were some changes in our family. Our parents were getting noticeably older, and our kids were growing up really fast. And I felt I needed to take a pause from landscapes and just spend some time doing family portraits. So, and because watercolors are so unforgiving, and once you start, you are pretty much committed to anything that you put down. You can't, because you can't use white and you're dependent on leaving the white of the paper, there's very little overwork that's possible. You kind of have one shot at it. And I hadn't done a lot of portraiture at the time, and portraits are difficult. So that was really my impetus to start working in acrylics. I knew that with acrylics, I could rework and have a better chance of getting the result that I wanted. So I spent probably a year and a half doing these family portraits, and I was really trying to paint people kind of as I see them and capture my relationship with them. So when I did my self-portrait, I painted myself looking in the bathroom mirror because that's the only time I ever see myself. So here I am looking sort of tired in the bathroom mirror. And that was great because it helped me develop my skills in acrylic. But it still didn't solve the problem of working more abstractly. And I really struggled with that, and finally decided to enroll in a couple of workshops with artists and instructors who work abstractly and non-objectively. So I took a series of workshops, mostly at St. Lawrence College in Brockville and a couple in Haliburton, with Karen Rosasco and Mark Rothier, Lila Lewis Irving, Kim Lee Ko, and each one had a very different approach to painting, very different way of working, which was great because it gave me the freedom I needed and the tools I needed to start to really experiment on my own in the studio. And that's when I'm really having the most fun in my studio, when I'm asking myself, wonder what would happen if, and then just trying things. So I became much more experimental in my work. I explored complete abstraction, working non-objectively, and did that for a period of time. And it's really interesting because over that time, what happened was every now and then I would start a painting, maybe with an idea in mind, maybe not. And right from the first go, I would get something that I liked quite a bit, but more often than not, that didn't happen. And I would let it dry and then work over it and still not be happy and let that layer dry and work over it again. And I started to realize that some of these paintings that I had really struggled with and worked over and over and over, in the end, were far more interesting than the ones that had kind of been done in one go. Because that history of layering, those little bits of underpainting that would be revealed through the layers above, gave the painting a texture and a visual interest that you just couldn't achieve with one layer. So I started very intentionally painting that way, which was also very liberating because it meant that at the outset of a painting, I knew that I wasn't committed to what I was putting down. It was just an underpainting, and it was just something that would kind of spur me on, and I would react to it with the next layer, and then I could selectively reveal or obscure what was below. And I also discovered in that process that a lot of the beautiful surface effects in acrylic depend on that kind of buildup of several layers. So, which is very much the way I teach now. If you take my abstract landscape course, a lot of it is focused on that kind of building up of layers. So interestingly, having done complete non-objective painting for a while, I was then able to get back into landscape in a more abstract way. So that was the bridge that I needed to start painting abstract landscapes. And I still do abstract landscapes, and sometimes I work from photos and sometimes I don't. I find when I have a reference photo, it's much harder to go completely abstract. And those paintings inevitably are less abstract and more representational, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. That's just the way it is. So I like to do a bit of both. Sometimes I like to work completely from my imagination. And that kind of brings me back to what my first drawing teacher taught us, which was paint what you see and not what you know. And the thing about always painting what you see, which basically means only paint with your subject in front of you, is it doesn't really allow for that more interpretive, expressive layer that comes when you paint from your imagination. I'm really lucky right now to have been able to quit my architectural job, and I paint full time, which I'm really loving. And, not that I didn't love my architectural career. I got into project management after a while, which was a real kind of people job, and really enjoyed it. But it got to the point where I felt like I was working full time as an architect and painting full time, which got to be a bit much. So for the past couple of years, I just paint and teach, and now I find I look back on the work that I was doing in the years leading up to that, and some of it looks a bit dark and broody to me now, and without necessarily realizing it, my work has really changed since I have more time to just relax and paint. It's lighter and brighter and more whimsical. And if you look back at this series, this is, I found myself at a certain point in a liminal space where I wanted to do something different than what I'd been doing. This happens periodically in my artwork, but didn't really know what to do next. So I started a piece which was completely non-objective and put some collage on it. And it was kind of interesting, but I didn't know where to go from there. And then I decided to paint over it, but leave a dot grid showing what was below, which was also kind of interesting. Didn't know where to go from there. And then I painted a cow on top, which is the first time I'd come back to painting cows in a long time. And I just kind of loved it. So I did a whole series of these dot grid cow paintings. And now I think I'm addicted to dot grids. After that, I painted some landscapes with just the dot grid and no cows. And now dot grids are kind of popping up in my abstracts and in my knitting and everything I'm doing. So I spent a long time working in acrylics, only really coming back to watercolors when we were on vacation and I was sketching, and really got into textures, experimenting with different acrylic mediums, and did some very textured work, which I still like to come back to sometimes. And then took a workshop just a couple of years ago with an artist and instructor who I've discovered and really enjoy, who's Jane Davies. And Jane had us working quite small, which was interesting because part of my development over the past couple of years had been to gradually work bigger and bigger until I was painting, 5-6 foot canvases. But what I discovered through her is that when I'm working in a small format, I'm much more inclined to take risks and do things that seem preposterous or just, ridiculous, like gluing rocks onto the canvas or squirting paint out of a cake decorator. And yet, when I do those things on a small piece or on a small series, inevitably the discoveries that I make there work their way into my bigger pieces afterwards. So now my process is I'll do a few big paintings and then I'll do a series of small ones. And I like that back and forth. And I've done, I also teach a workshop now called Painting in Series, where I really kind of emphasize that, because even my bigger work does tend to be working in series, but there's something about starting a whole bunch of small ones all at once and just kind of very quickly working through them so that at the end of a day, or at the end of a week, you have 10 or 20 pieces. It's very satisfying and very energizing in a way that sometimes doesn't happen when you work on bigger pieces and you get a little bit more kind of hung up on, it's got to be good, it's got to be, likable, I want someone to buy this. So those are some of the influences that have affected the way I work now. Now, a few years ago, and then again last year, we traveled to India, and the first time with our kids, the second time was just me and my husband. And we were there for several months, so I had time to paint, and was traveling with quite a pared down kit. So what I discovered works really well as a travel kit is I would have just a few small tubes of watercolor and some acrylic gesso. So this violated one of Tondino's rules, which is, no white paint with watercolors. And I should say one of most watercolor society's cardinal rules as well. But it's actually a great combination. So tubes of watercolor paint, acrylic gesso, which is completely opaque but also matte, so it works nicely with the watercolors, and then a few fine liners and gel pens to finish the details. So I did a whole series of sketches that way. I recently published a book of my sketches, and but was really interested in painting people when I was there rather than landscape, particularly the things about people that are different, the way they dress, the things that they do in the small villages. And while I was painting people, I was trying to very consciously not paint in perspective, but use some of the modernists' techniques of flattening the figure and flattening the landscape so that the whole picture kind of moves into the plane of the canvas. And in doing so, it allows you much more freedom to manipulate the image. And it's a step towards painting figures in the landscape more abstractly, which is really something that I want to learn to do, that I'm very drawn to when I look at other artists' work. And kind of what I'm working on right now, and I would say the paintings that I did in India and the ones I'm doing right now are not particularly abstract, but they are figures in the landscape, and I'm really kind of working with getting the quality of light, simplifying the figures, and and really kind of developing that relationship between the landscape and the figure. So this is some of my recent work. This is kind of where I'm at right now, and that's my path. That's how I've come to be where I am. So now you've had a chance to get to know me a bit, and I would love to have a chance to hear from you. So please send me an email or connect with me on Facebook or Instagram, and I hope to see you next summer in Haliburton. Thanks.